Lucian, I'm sure our audience are dying to understand what you have in your brain for 2023 and your predictions. It would be great before we get into that to learn a little bit more about you and what your journey's been to this point.
Yeah, so I've been at Savills since I was a graduate, actually. So I joined way back in 1993 in the metropolis that is Wimborne Minster in Dorset.
Excellent. That's where I'm from, even.
Yeah, I mean, and actually that Wimborne stronghold in Savills, if you know Savills and you know exactly what that Wimborne office brings, and that was a fantastic grounding. I worked there for 7 years as a land agent. I then moved across to our Winchester office, where I took responsibility for running a team of land agents in 2001. I did that until 2007. Really good experience of almost building a business from the ground up. Lots of hard graft, plenty of long hours, as much innovation as you could possibly do to build a business. And I think just at the point that I had that, what I felt I had that thing ticking and working really well, I got the call to see if I would go and take up a more central role within Savills, which was within the research team. And I suppose, my background is I've got a fairly strong academic track record. I was lucky enough to study land economy at Cambridge University, albeit at the point of the lowest level of academic performance in the course's history. I put that caveat in. But I've always had that academic bent, so a career in research has played out very well for me. And that's what I've been doing for the last 15 years. And in that, I guess I've learnt, the value of independent, objective views on everything to do with the housing market, but critically delivered with a degree of personality, because there's plenty of competition in that space from other researchers. But if you can deliver it with personality, then hopefully, and you've got that objectivity that people respect, then hopefully that's the magic mix that means that when you've got a raft of reports you could look at, you go to Savills first. Absolutely. Hopefully. So there's a load of lessons in there.
Excellent. And we've been lucky enough to have you at a number of our events, and it's always great having you join us. I think a researcher with personality is far better than one without. So
otherwise it's a pretty hard sell. Let's be absolutely honest.
Yeah,
Not everybody loves the charts and graphs in the way that I obsess and my team obsess over.
Excellent. So moving on to that, 2022 has been a year of, two halves, I suppose. Yeah. What are the positives that have come out of 2022, and heading into 2023? Where do you think we're going?
Yeah, well, I think if we talk about it as a year of two halves, in reality, it was a year of 3 quarters and 1 quarter. Everything up until September, you had a long tail to the effects of the pandemic, and people continued to look for more space in their home as a result of all of those that experience of lockdown that lived much longer in the memory than I think that we expected, and that drove significant levels of housing demand against the context of actually not that much stock being available on the market. And clearly what that did was play to the hands of the new build developers, because where the second-hand market didn't have the stock available, the new build developers and the developers and the house builders generally had that stock. And in the vast majority of cases, it was good quality stock, and they'd also had a period of time where they could adjust what they were delivering to the new demands that were coming from the market, that requirement perhaps to work from home more often, the requirement for decent access to outside space. All of those things played out. And of course, there was also the benefit of Help to Buy for the vast majority of the year, the sort of final throes of that Help to Buy scheme, which has been crucially important to increasing housing delivery across the UK. It's the thing that has, if you like, broken that long-standing connection between the number of transactions going on in the second-hand market and where the house builders perceive the capacity of the market to be. So it sort of broke that correlation and allowed a much higher level of house building. But then we got to September, we'd had already, 7 successive interest rate rises. They were creeping perhaps rather than racing up. But in September, I think that did mark a turning point for the market, a sharp increase in the cost of mortgage debt, and that really beginning to affect how far people were either able to stretch themselves when they went to buy a new home, or the amount of debt that the bank would make available to them. And I think that means that whichever way you cut it, it is going to be a challenging housing market in 2023 for house builders to develop into. I think what it will do inevitably is mean that they focus very heavily on their strengths. They concentrate much more on what their selling point is and what their point of difference might be. And there's some things that just come out of the experience of 2022 that will play well to them. Generally we're building good quality, energy efficient stock, whereas our old stock, has got real challenges around energy efficiency. And at a time when energy costs are high, I think that is a strong driver of a continuation of a new build premium. But I think it also means that new build premium lasts for longer after people have bought the home. And again, I think that's a selling point. But I do think for most house builders, it's going to be back to the fundamentals of demand, building to market demand, making sure that their product is absolutely on the money to fit the profile and the demographic of demand. I think more will probably concentrate on the bits of the market less affected. So I think I suspect you'll still see a stronger demand for slightly older persons housing, particularly amongst downsizers. I think that is a market which continues to be relatively underexploited, where there remain opportunities. So plenty of change in 2023, challenging market conditions, but what we always know in that is that the best will rise to the top. It's always the case in these circumstances.
Excellent. So if you were a sales and marketing director of a house builder with 2023 ahead of you, what specifically would you be looking at?
Yeah, I think the environmental credentials of the stuff that you're building are going to be crucially important, because people are going to have a very close eye on costs of heating and running that house. And not just that, the lenders, when they go to test your affordability, are going to have a very keen eye on those basic living costs and costs of spend, and therefore how much surplus income that gives you and what mortgage you're able to get. I think the other thing, to pay attention to, clearly cost of mortgage debt is going to rise, and the availability of higher loan to value mortgages, I think, is going to get tighter again. So that means using schemes like deposit unlock where it's available, and I know some of the lenders have drawn back from that recently, but actually thinking very carefully, what is it that's going to replace Help to Buy to keep a reasonably steady stream of first-time buyers coming into the market? And I think that's the area where there's a bit of uncertainty. Without Help to Buy, how strong is that first-time buyer demand going to be at a time when they've got still to raise quite a big deposit in many cases, but they've also got they have to spend more to service that mortgage. So I think focusing on what it is they can do to help that end of the market is going to be really important. But all the other things, quality of place, not just building houses. It's not just building houses and apartments, is it? It is about the quality of place. And in a market which there's going to be a bit more differentiation. People are perhaps going to be a bit more picky about what they want. They're probably going to have more choice. All of those things around quality of build, quality of place, the amenity offering that goes alongside the housing product, I think are going to be crucial points of marketing as we go forward.
Okay, excellent. And so Savills are forecasting a 10% drop in house prices potentially for next year. And with average house prices circa 9 times income at the moment, a 10% drop, that's a fair drop, but still affordability is substantially stretched. What do you feel is the solution to that?
So I think it's really difficult, isn't it? And it's not, it doesn't always sit comfortably for a major estate agency to have a research department saying that house prices are going to fall by 10% over the course of the next year. But the evidence for that, the constraints on people's budgets, the amount people are able to borrow, just point to that level of price adjustment. And actually, in the market, there is no point having lofty expectations of what you're going to be able to sell your homes for and suddenly see your rates of sale fall away very dramatically. So there is always a need for that objectivity, the ability to call it as it is. And that's really what sits behind it. But it's not quite. This is very different to, say, the early 1990s or 2007, because for a number of reasons, I don't think what you're going to see is that big increase in forced sales that you saw in the 1990s, for a number of reasons. More existing homeowners have locked into fixed rate mortgages. And yes, when they come to an end, that there's a sharp increase in their mortgage costs, but it means they filter into the market over a period of time rather than landing in one go. Yeah. The second point, I think, is that most people who took on a mortgage who hadn't locked into a fixed rate of 5 years or more, well, all of them would have been stress tested on what they could afford. And that stress testing up until August was really rigorous. So to an extent, their household finances have already been tested to make sure they can afford it. It will be very uncomfortable for some people, no doubt about that, but it shouldn't, in most cases, be wholly unmanageable.
And are they stress tested to the level of inflation and interest rates at the moment?
Yeah, so the way that the mortgage regulation used to work, and this came in 2014 or 2016, the exact date escapes me at the moment, is that if you didn't lock into a 5-year fixed rate, the bank was required to say, can you still afford the mortgage if you revert to the bank's standard variable rate plus 3%? So that was a really quite stringent affordability stress test. Of course, what that meant is that you shouldn't end up with a large glut of people who've taken on too much mortgage debt that they simply can't service. The other thing that happened that took us slightly by surprise in 2022 was they relaxed that mortgage regulation in August. And now the test is essentially standard variable rate plus 1%. Now that means, and this is the crucial point, whilst interest rates might go up a bit further, bank base rate particularly, as and when you tame the beast of inflation, interest rates come back down the other side, you've got a lower stress test to meet than you had previously. And that opens up, surprisingly, a bit more capacity for medium-term price growth. So there's definitely something about, yes, we think house prices could come back by 10% in the next year. You look at that against the context of 26% house price growth in the wake of the pandemic. But even over the medium term, as bank base rates gradually brought down, it still means that over a 5-year period, you should be at break-even point with a little bit of net house price growth. And I think for the people going into the market, next year, I think one of the other things, the correction that we see in prices will occur quite quickly, and it always occurs more quickly than is shown in the statistics. So that means you've actually got this quiet point. Well, actually, look, the market's adjusted. This is now looking like a good time to buy, and your mortgage repayments will get easier in due course as interest rates fall. So again, I think that will be in due course over 2023. That there will definitely be a point in the market where buyers' attitudes shift. Might take until 2024 actually for it to occur, but certainly at some point they'll work out that they're getting close to the bottom of the market.
So at this point in time, house builders should be looking at repricing available stock, do you feel?
Yeah, so I think you're going to see all of the things that you normally see, don't you, in more difficult trading conditions. I think you will see some people setting or readjusting their asking prices to make sure that they fit with current market conditions. Already we're seeing a lot more incentives offered. And if you look at what those incentives might be at the extreme, you look at the two sources of stress amongst households who might be buying, their energy costs and their higher mortgage costs. And so you are seeing some incentives out there about contributions towards energy costs over the first X years of ownership. In some circumstances, you're seeing offers such as meeting mortgage payments for a period. So it's gone well beyond things like the white goods that we traditionally associate with. And I think if you get the balance right in there, then and you can allay the fears of those buyers, that keeps them in the market, keeps them looking at buying your stock. The other thing I think that is going to be important, it's going to be forced upon, I think, most of the house builders is going to be not just the energy efficiency of the house, so how much energy it radiates and loses. It's also going to be the source of the energy going in, and a much greater focus on renewables. Yeah. And there, you would say from a consumer perspective, it's okay, that's moving fast, isn't it? How do I know that what is in place is future-proofed? How do I know that what's going in today that's right is right for tomorrow? And so I think you need to be at the forefront of that. It's not going to go away. It's only going to get tighter. So all of the things that we talk about, whether it's use of solar, whether it's air source heat pumps, in extreme circumstances, ground source heat pumps, all of that stuff, we're going to just get much more we are getting and going to have to get more familiar with. But we've also got to explain to the consumer what it means.
But interestingly, obviously, regulations stipulating changes on that front, and a lot of house builders at the moment are doing the bare minimum. There are some that are kind of pioneering. If you were a house builder now, would you be looking to be a pioneer in order to differentiate and to have a point of difference even between second-hand and new homes?
I think the ones who will be successful will be the ones who embrace the challenge. And that's the case in a lot of parts of business, isn't it? You have to take learnings from previous experience. To develop those experiences, you need to be pretty much at the cutting edge of that. And I think there's a point that we're seeing now, and I think it will only increase going forward, is instead of looking at the energy efficiency measures as an additional cost, you need to look at it as a point of difference in your product and something that can continue to generate a premium
to view it as a marketing spend even,
and to sustain that premium.
Yeah.
And that then allows you to get closer to zero carbon ambitions, whatever else it might be. And the technology's moved pretty fast, hasn't it? I've been in this research game for 15 years. You looked at the costs of getting towards high levels of energy efficiency. They were absolutely eye-watering. You needed to do it at scale to bring those costs down. But we've moved in that 15 years. Even in the last 5 years, we've moved a long way. And I think for those house builders, go and look at some of the stuff that's being done. Get up to the University of Salford. Go and look at the options that are available. I think there's great learnings that will be taken. I think 2023 will be a year when the industry just embraces that much more greatly.
Excellent. So the new build premium at the moment sits around plus 40%. That I'm assuming is a lot down to the availability of stock over the last 12 months. That there's obviously a substantial difference between the second-hand market and the new homes market at the moment. Do you feel that new build premium will be reduced as we move into 23?
That sounds like a very punchy new build premium to me. I would say generally on the local market, but there is one that exists. I think inevitably it will come under pressure in weaker market conditions. That's often the case. So that just really lays out the challenge, doesn't it? How do you continue to justify a premium in more difficult market conditions? And that is about matching market demand. It is about an exceptional product. And I think it has to be about an exceptional product. And I think with those circumstances, particularly with some of these things around energy, but also, thinking about the types of market that you're selling into. So, if you look at where demand is likely to be most affected over 2023, it's going to be amongst first-time buyers without the benefit of Help to Buy, much more challenging for them, and buy-to-let investors who face a raft of regulation and therefore some calls on their cash. So then it's about matching demand to the parts of the market that remain stronger. Cash buyer market, classically, downsizer market, all of those things we've learned around downsizing, need for more storage space, make sure that you have got the spare bedroom in there, some of the benefits of turnkey that come with a lot of new build, making sure that you've worked out whether or not the location is right for those downsizers, I think is really important. But also some of those people who are now on the next part of their journey, who are looking to trade up the housing market. They've now got some housing equity behind them because of the house price growth that we've seen over the period of the last, the net house price growth we've seen over the period of the next 2.5 years. Again, their ability to get a mortgage and service that mortgage should be easier than perhaps the first-time buyer. So if you're going to sustain your new build premium and you're going to sell into that, you've got to sell into those key markets and you've got to match your product to that. And that's all of those other things, isn't it? Like increase in home working. All of those things that you need to accommodate to make sure that your product is matched to market demand. That's actually much more difficult to retrofit in second-hand stock.
Go's announcement, very, very recent events. There's a lot of problems in the marketplace at the moment. What do you feel specifically is broken at the moment?
Well, where do you want to start on that one? I mean,
let's not talk about planning.
let's not talk about planning. But look, it is fundamentally important. I mean, I don't think in my 15 years I can remember a period where the relationship between the house building industry and the housing minister has been under the strain that you see at the moment. And
why do you feel that is?
Why? It's very difficult to talk about that without talking about personality, isn't it? But I think, when Gove came to office, he was very clear that he wanted to solve the issue around cladding. That was absolutely his number one priority. He looked at where he could make a difference in that respect, and he looked to the house building industry to solve it. I think the house building industry now feels, actually, do you know what? You've had your pound of flesh. What we're in for is more than we ever were responsible for. And that just doesn't engender sort of, if you like, great relations between the two. But equally, that the housing minister has been slightly beholden to the backbenchers. Now, you were starting to see the benefits of relatively robust and fixed housing targets in bringing development land through the planning system. Wasn't always easy. Often that land had to come through at appeal. But if you didn't have the 5-year land supply, if you couldn't meet the housing delivery test as a local authority, and you weren't bringing forward enough houses in the areas of highest housing need, then actually, you at appeal, it was going to be a real struggle. Things were going to turn around, and we started to see a lot more consents come back from that. Of course, the problem that's created in the shires is that doesn't necessarily play well to some of the core Tory voter householders who, in a gross generalisation, tend to be more NIMBY than YIMBY. And Amersham and Chesham by-election, I think, was probably the thing that changed that. So Michael Gove's hand has been forced, I would say, in some respect. He had to find a way through that, and we now have the situation where it's not mandatory, it's more guidance. And I think that creates a very uncertain planning environment. And I think inevitably what that will mean is a fall in housing delivery. But let's just put that into context. At some point, whichever political party is in power, and you can start to see this feeding through into thinking, the penny will drop. There are consequences of not building enough homes. There are consequences in younger generations' ability to get on the housing ladder. There are uncomfortable consequences for how long they stay at home for that older generation who are more NIMBY in nature. And actually, if you're going to get that younger person's vote, you need to keep alive the aspirations of home ownership. And until such point as they're able to do that, the ability to provide them with a good place to live. So the other thing I think that you will need to see is a greater political embracing of build to rent. When at a time when the private buy-to-let landlord is under pressure, you can see that happening at the moment. Really strong levels of rental growth, putting pressure on younger people's household incomes simply because you've got an undersupply of private rented stock. And the only way to solve that is to build more. And so I think some of these consequences are going to become blatantly apparent over a period. And as a result, I think in due course you will see a switch back to firmer housing targets. The difficulty is it's going to take at least 2 years for that to occur, isn't it? So no, I do think it's difficult, but there is some light at the end of the tunnel. Let's not get ourselves too depressed around that.
And so with things down at the moment, the outlook for the next 12 months is fairly bleak, but there's still opportunities to be had, major opportunities to be had. Looking sort of in the longer term, so over the next decade, where do you feel the big opportunities are for house builders?
Well, look, some of it will depend undoubtedly on government policy. I think for the house builders generally, build to rent is an area which in some cases divides opinion. We have house builders who generally are set up to build directly for the consumer, but there is significant capital pointed at this build-to-rent sector. It has evolved and developed more quickly than I think most of us expected, and purpose-built private rented sector accommodation there's significant demand for it amongst private renters. There's a wall of capital coming, and I think you will see that evolve. For those institutions to deliver those homes, they've got to partner with the developers, because you can only generate it through new build stock. So that, I think, over the period of the next 10 years is going to be something that grows dramatically. You can see it, for example, because that also plays into things like social impact investing. What greater social impact investing than you can have than to provide one of the basic necessities of life, which is shelter and homes. And you can see those social things in behind moves like Citra, which is the Lloyds Bank arm of looking at the provision of private rented stock from the new build sector. So I think that will grow. Other unexploited opportunities, I still think the big unexploited opportunity within the UK housing market is the provision of more housing for older people that allows them to downsize. Because we have a situation where we have an increasing number of wealthy homeowners who need to supplement their pension provision, who are living in a home that is too big for their needs. They have a much keener eye on the cost of running that home as a result of events over the period of the last 12 to 24 months, and yet they remain pretty wedded to it. And actually their retirement offering at the moment is not nearly as diverse as it could be. I think they also, there is this also thing that has changed dramatically in the last decade. There's a generation who see it as their responsibility to help get their kids on the housing ladder. And the only way they can do that is release some of their housing wealth. So I think, I do think that older person's downsizing market is another area that's going to grow pretty substantially.
And do you see, as we work with a number of retirement developers, and there are common complaints from these downsizers as to the cost of downsizing. Do you see any government incentives coming into play to incentivize these downsizers to move out of much needed family accommodation into more suitable retirement accommodation? Yeah,
well, I think the answer is probably to stop disincentivizing them to do so as much as anything, so that we know that stamp duty is stated as a barrier. It's not an easy political sell when you're saying we're going to release your stamp duty bill so that you can unlock very substantial housing wealth that you've built up by virtue of the year you were born. That's not an easy sell. But the fact of the matter is, if we're going to get more efficient use of our housing stock, we've got to remove some of these barriers. And if you looked at, so for the first time, I think, reading the papers over the period of the last 2 months, you could see that government were at least considering it. A long way from necessarily doing something, but they were considering it. It was filtering into, okay, how do we make this work? The other thing that I think is also going to be quite interesting is, clearly we're in a situation where there's going to be a focus on raising more tax. One of the reasons that you have limited levels of downsizing is you have an incredibly generous inheritance tax allowance for your main home. If the government were to say, actually, that does look pretty generous, then again, there is a more of an incentive, I think, for people to downsize for that market. But fundamentally, to make it work, you need the stock. And as a house builder, you can wait for the government to act, or you can kind of get on with it and say, what is it that looks like aspirational older people's housing, where they look at it, they look at what they're living in currently, and they say, it better suits my needs, it's cheaper to run, and I'm going to enjoy living here. And if you can get, you can't just sit back and wait. You've got to develop that product, and some of that will be linked to provision very specifically of retirement housing with added levels of care that sits alongside that. But by no means all. So,
Did you feel, obviously, Help to Buy was a very good catalyst at getting the market moving, first-time buyers onto the ladder. Is there a similar kind of scheme at the other end, which is a government-led incentive to say to these downsizers, here's a carrot?
it's difficult to pinpoint exactly what it would be. And I don't think you can be holding out hope for that necessarily, because you've got this, the fundamental problem that you've got from a political perspective is you have a massive and widening generational divide in housing wealth. And a giveaway to the wealthy in the current socioeconomic circumstances is a very difficult political sell, you would say. The other thing I think that will happen is, let's just, other areas that there will be growth. If you believe the polls and the general election happens in 2 years and you do have a change in government, then there's a few interesting things there. One, the Labour Party is saying that they want to increase levels of home ownership, so that's on their radar, that's on their agenda. But we also know it will put more of an emphasis on the provision of affordable housing. So there's part of understanding what that means. So I think for a lot of house builders, that's also, what do I need to do in terms of partnerships with the affordable housing providers, particularly at a point in time when affordable providers are quite stretched because they've got to decarbonise their existing housing stock and they've got to deal with some building quality issues. That's a big call on their capital. And so that suggests that if you want to deliver more affordable housing, you need some partnership. You need some partnership. And now is the time to set it up. Don't wait until, the great sea change. Get it done now so you're in a position to take advantage of that as you go forward.
Excellent. And where specifically do you feel that regulation is holding the sector back at this point in time?
Well, look, I mean, the natural order of events is that we blame the planners, isn't it? And I do think we have an incredibly complicated planning system. There are risks with some of the rhetoric that we've heard out that actually, that might get more difficult before it gets better. But I think fundamentally you've got to continue to bring more land through the system. And you've got to give developers more certainty that they are going to get a planning consent if they're going to speculate those quite significant costs in terms of promoting that land. And that is fundamentally, that is where it starts. I don't think you're going to see, personally, I don't think you're ever going to see the return of things like mortgage interest relief at source. I just think by doing that, almost by trying to ease the issues of affordability of housing, you can compound the problem by doing that. Very difficult then to unwind. So I don't think that's where it's going to be on the demand side. But I think a lot can be done around planning, areas of regulation, that aren't going to ease. I think anything around energy efficiency and zero carbon, those regulations they're just going to grow. So we just got to get with the program on that. So
you've had a slight role change, Minister of Housing.
Yes.
You're sat in Go's seat. What would you do to change the planning system?
Oh my Lord. Well, look, I think, so you've got to do something significant around local plan adoption. The first thing I do is I'll go to the Prime Minister, whoever the Prime Minister of the day is. And I would say the Housing Minister needs to be in post for the entire length of Parliament, because this revolving door of housing ministers just means that you don't get the consistency of policy. And we see it. New housing minister comes in post. It takes them X months to learn the mechanics of the way the thing operates, and to form an opinion as to what they're trying to do. And then X months later, they're out of post, and you're reinventing the wheel constantly. So I think, and genuinely, that person needs to have an interest in housing. It can't just be seen as a test bed to see whether or not you can take on a more senior cabinet position. So I think that, that's the first thing I think that you've got to do. I then think on planning, you have got to find a way that you have robust housing delivery targets, and that you can ensure that local authorities have got an up-to-date local plan system. That has got to become so much slicker, and you have got to throw a lot more resource at that. And I think whilst you need to have regard to local demands and local politics, I think you should have a task force around local plan provision that possibly becomes a support function of central government. So you don't end up with this situation where planners are just dealing with people extending their homes, soaking up massive amounts of their time, when there is a much bigger issue around increasing housing delivery to meet the needs of the population that needs doing. So I think increased planning resource, it's particularly increased resource which is pointed at local plan preparation. For me, are probably, and you do need some targets. I mean, I think if you just don't have targets, the reality is that very few district councillors get elected on a pro-development agenda. How many district councillors come through, shove the leaflet through and say, and one of the things I'm going to do is build 5,000 new homes in your neighbourhood. No one does it. So acknowledging, acknowledging that, then in some ways you need to have targets that people are having to adhere to. And there was a big change in the 1990s, wasn't there? You went from the presumption against towards the presumption for development. You've really got to live by that, I think, as you go forward.
So with Gove's announcement, where do we go from here?
Goodness me, I think it's really difficult because I can't see that over the lifetime of that parliament it's going to be eased in any particular way. I think there is a real risk that local plan preparation slips even further. I think there is greater wriggle room for people who are a long way through that local plan preparation to decide not to adopt it. And I think that probably means that we're going to see, I think you will see a fall in housing delivery, but I think it will be that fall in housing delivery and the consequences of that, which will become apparent pretty quickly, that will mean at some point there has to be another change in direction. At the point that occurs, let's just hope you get some consistent housing policy. And of course, the obvious thing to do is to get cross-party support for a home building generation, for a home building program that meets the needs of future generations. Is that too much to ask? I fear it probably is. But you talk to a load of those politicians who have a genuine interest in that, who perhaps are not at the extremes of either end of the political spectrum, and they see this need for a coordinated approach to a mix of housing tenures being delivered at scale. And there are a group who probably could do it from across different parties. They're just not, fully far left or far right.
From a subjective point of view, any individual could see that the announcement is a poor one. Ultimately, a subjective individual would see that there is a need for housing, and that the decision that has been made by Gove is not going to increase the supply of housing that is required. Do you feel it's a purely political decision?
Yeah, it's undoubtedly got caught up in politics. And I think the decision that has been made recently, particularly against the context that we're in for more market conditions, cannot point to greater delivery of housing unless you suddenly find the electorate in certain areas says, come on, you're not meeting the housing needs of the next generation. We'll drop some of those NIMBY attitudes and we're going to demand more housing. But that's quite difficult, I think. So look, I think there are going to be some real pressures around housing delivery, and I fear that things have got caught up in politics too greatly. We've lost the ability for some, you would argue, more rational decision making. But as we know, we go through phases and we go through political cycles. Even without necessarily a change in government, we go through these political cycles, and you can even see in some of the commentary that's coming out, there is this, you've got quite a divide even within the Conservative Party between those, who are perhaps looking at who their core electorate is and what their views are, against the others who are saying, hang on, we should be the party of home ownership and aspiration and home building. But that's as far as I'm prepared to push it politically, because after all, my job is to be objective and as neutral as possible in in these conversations.
Of course. So to close, Lucian, you're buying a new home. You're stood at the steps of the new home.
Yeah.
You're about to be given a viewing. Yeah. Anybody can do that viewing. So you're going to get an hour with that individual. They'll show you every room. You can sit on the sofa, have a conversation with them. Who would you pick? So it could be a celebrity. It could be a family member. Who would you pick to do that and why?
Oh, my Lord. No, there's a question, isn't it? So look, I'm quite a big fan of deadpan humour. I just love to see the way that Jack D would do it. I'm not sure that he would sell me the house. Let's be perfectly honest. But he'd definitely have something to say, wouldn't it? And if he had a sidekick, it'll probably be Paul Merton. Excellent. Just to take things a little bit left field. So that's definitely, I think, where I would go.
Excellent. Well, we'll see what we can do.
Fantastic.
Lucia, thanks so much for your time. It's been, you hold a huge amount of knowledge, and it's been a real pleasure to have you.
The pleasure's been mine.
Thank you.
Thanks.